May 3, 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing like a dying star. Across Germany, cities lay in ruins and smoke from burning factories blurred the horizon. Yet deep beneath the Harz Mountains, in tunnels carved by slave labor, something extraordinary remained, a secret weapon unlike anything the Allies had ever seen. The V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, a machine capable of touching the edge of space before crashing back to Earth at supersonic speed. It was the pride of Hitler's wonder weapon program, the technological miracle that was supposed to reverse the course of the war. But as the Reich crumbled, it wasn't the rockets that would make history, it was the race to capture them. The Americans had learned of Peenemoon's experiments through aerial reconnaissance and underground intelligence. Photographs revealed sleek fin cylinders resting on launch pads, casting long shadows across the Baltic sand. To Allied analysts, it was terrifying proof that Germany was fighting on a higher technological plane. The V-2 could strike London from hundreds of miles away, arriving faster than sound, giving no warning. But with Germany nearing defeat, the question changed from how to stop it to who would seize it first. The Soviet army was closing in from the east, and their appetite for German science was insatiable. The Americans knew they had days, perhaps hours, to secure the future. At the heart of this drama was the Werner von Braun team, a collection of brilliant yet morally fractured engineers who had built their empire on forced labor and ambition. As the war turned hopeless, they made a fateful decision to surrender to the Americans. Von Braun understood that in Soviet hands they would become tools of vengeance. In American hands, they might become architects of the next century. So as the Nazi state collapsed, convoys of German scientists began driving south through burning villages, hauling boxes of blueprints and film reels. Somewhere near Oberammergau, U.S. Army intelligence intercepted them. By the time Soviet troops reached the same valley days later, the Germans and their secrets were gone. The operation that followed was codenamed Paperclip. Its early form began before Berlin even fell. The U.S. Army's technical intelligence teams, many of them engineers in uniform, fanned out across defeated Germany with orders that sounded simple. Find anything related to advanced weapons, jet engines, and rockets. In reality, it was chaos. Laboratories were destroyed, records burned, and scientists scattered. Every minute counted. Competing Allied units raced to reach the same sites, and at times, American and Soviet patrols exchanged nervous glances across smoldering roads, unsure who would move first. The scientists, terrified and calculating, often surrendered to whichever flag appeared first. When the first American officers arrived at Nordhausen, they stepped into a nightmare. The underground rocket assembly plant, Dormittelwerk, stretched for miles, a vast maze of tunnels reeking of death. Thousands of slave laborers had died there under the SS's watch, buried in shallow graves along the walls. Yet among the horror lay rows of intact V-2 parts, tools, and instruments. The Americans began cataloging everything at frantic speed. Engineers from the Army Ordnance Corps filled notebooks with sketches, measurements, and equations. They photographed every machine, every panel, every unexploded missile. Each discovery carried both scientific wonder and moral weight. In less than a week, entire convoys of captured material began rolling west. Train cars groaned under the weight of rocket components, fuel pumps, and guidance systems. Soldiers guarded crates labeled in German script they couldn't read, not realizing they held the foundation of space travel. The Germans watched in stunned silence as the Americans worked with precision bordering on obsession. What took the Reich years to build was being dismantled in days. They move as if they already know how it all works, one captured scientist muttered to a fellow engineer. He wasn't far from the truth. The Americans had anticipated this moment. As early as 1943, research groups at Aberdeen Proving Ground and the California Institute of Technology had studied reports of German rockets, theorizing their flight mechanics. When the physical evidence finally arrived, they were ready. Within hours of securing Nordhausen, teams of U.S. specialists, ordnance experts, linguists, and mathematicians began sorting through German documents, identifying key diagrams, and mapping propulsion data. What the Germans had expected to take months of careful translation was being absorbed almost instantly. The speed shocked them. Their secret science, once guarded by SS patrols and coded language, was now being unpacked like a manual by men who had never seen a rocket fly. As news of the discovery spread, more American units rushed toward potential rocket sites. General Dwight D. Eisenhower personally ordered that all V-2 components found in Germany be consolidated for shipment to the United States. The British, furious but pragmatic, agreed to share their findings in exchange for test access. The Soviets, arriving too late at most key facilities, were left with fragments, damaged engines, burnt blueprints, and a handful of low-level technicians. But in the West, the Americans had seized the crown jewel, the scientists themselves. Von Braun and his core team were taken to a secure compound in Bavaria. There, under interrogation, they were astonished to learn how much the Americans already knew. U.S. intelligence officers questioned them not with awe, but with technical fluency, discussing combustion ratios, gyroscopic guidance, and range optimization as equals. The Germans had expected their captors to be soldiers. They found engineers in uniform. It was a cultural shock that would ripple for decades. By June 1945, the captured scientists were quietly relocated to the United States. At Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at White Sands, New Mexico, they began reconstructing the very weapon that had terrorized Europe, this time under a new flag. The Germans were stunned by the speed and scale of American adaptation. Within months, the U.S. had reassembled operational V-2s and begun launching them into the desert sky. Data was transmitted, analyzed, and replicated at a pace no German institution could have matched under wartime conditions. To the scientists who had spent years working in secrecy, the openness and resources of their new host seemed almost unreal. Behind the scenes, the ethical questions were immense. Many of these engineers had served the Nazi regime directly, overseeing forced labor and weapon production. But the U.S. government, now facing a rising Soviet threat, saw them as vital assets in the coming Cold War. Operation Paperclip expanded rapidly, absorbing physicists, aerodynamicists, and chemists from across Germany. What began as a race for rockets became a global struggle for knowledge. In conference rooms from Washington to Moscow, generals realized that whoever controlled these minds would control the future. For the Germans themselves, it was a paradox. They had lost everything, their homeland, their cause, their pride, but their intellect had become the most valuable currency in the world. Watching American teams disassemble years of work in a matter of weeks filled them with a strange mix of humiliation and admiration. They think in systems, one former Peenemünde engineer wrote later. We thought in machines, they are faster because they see the whole picture. By the time the first American V-2 rose from the New Mexico desert, streaking into the stratosphere, the German scientists stood silently at the edge of the launch pad, their faces lit by the same fire they once served. They had been captured not just by soldiers, but by an idea that science could outlive ideology. Yet even then, as the roar faded into the sky, they could not shake the memory of the tunnels and the dead who had built it all. For them, the speed of American triumph was both awe-inspiring and unbearable, proof that their war for mastery of the future had already been lost long before their nation surrendered. By the final months of the war, the race for German scientific secrets had turned into a desperate, silent sprint across a collapsing empire. The Allies called it Operation Paperclip, though at the time, it was little more than a hastily organized scramble through the rubble. The Soviets were closing in from the east, and every day that passed meant another laboratory, another mind, lost to the Red Army. For the Americans, securing Germany's top scientists wasn't just about winning the war, it was about shaping the peace that would follow. In a small town near Nordhausen, deep within the Harz Mountains, the Americans found what they had been searching for. Beneath the hills lay an underground complex, Mittelwerk, a grim labyrinth carved out by slave labor from concentration camps. The stench of oil and decay hung thick in the air. When the soldiers entered the tunnels, they didn't just find rockets, they found the future. Rows of sleek, finned V-2 missiles lined the walls, each one capable of traveling hundreds of miles to deliver a ton of explosives in minutes. It was a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. But what shocked the American engineers most wasn't the rockets themselves, it was how advanced the German design work had become. These weren't mere prototypes. They were operational, battle-tested, mass-produced. The control systems used gyroscopic stabilization. The propulsion chambers were mathematically precise. And the guidance units, built using delicate servo mechanisms, demonstrated an understanding of aerodynamics and telemetry that seemed decades ahead of its time. Many American officers later admitted that, had the Germans been given 6 more months, London might have been reduced to rubble. The Americans began moving quickly. Capturing the hardware wasn't enough, they needed the minds behind it. At the top of the list was Wernher von Braun, a young, charismatic engineer whose obsession with space travel had been repurposed by the Nazi regime into designing the deadliest rocket in the world. When American intelligence agents finally reached him near Oberammergau, they found a man who understood his value. Von Braun and his team of scientists had already burned their documents, packed their families, and were waiting to surrender to the Americans, specifically not the Soviets. The speed of the American operation stunned even the Germans themselves. Within days, convoys of captured scientists were being quietly escorted out of occupied zones. The Americans didn't waste time with bureaucracy. They were already thinking ahead, to the coming atomic age, to ballistic missiles, to the possibility of space. In some cases, officers forged signatures, bypassed orders, and classified entire trainloads of equipment just to keep them from falling into Soviet hands. The race wasn't just for military advantage, it was for ideological survival. Meanwhile, Soviet troops were arriving at Peenemünde, the coastal test facility where the V-2 had been born. But they were too late. The Americans had already stripped it bare. What the Soviets found instead were concrete shells, destroyed test stands, and scattered technical debris. Infuriated, Stalin ordered his own version of paperclip, codenamed Operation Astonishing, which would later abduct over 2,000 German scientists from the Soviet-occupied zone. But the Americans had already secured the crown jewels. Von Braun, his lead engineers, and over 100 tons of V-2 components, blueprints, and prototypes. When the first crates of captured technology arrived in the United States, engineers at White Sands, New Mexico could hardly believe their eyes. American rocketry had been primitive, small test models, low-altitude boosters barely reaching the edge of the atmosphere. Now they had in their hands a weapon capable of crossing continents. As technicians reassembled the V-2s under von Braun's supervision, it became clear that Germany's wartime obsession with precision and experimentation had yielded a breakthrough decades ahead of anyone else's research. But behind the triumph was a haunting discovery. The same tunnels at Mittelwerk that held these marvels of engineering also held the remains of thousands of prisoners from the Dora concentration camp. The men who had built the rockets were not scientists or soldiers. They were slaves, starved and beaten to death to meet production quotas. The Americans documented the horrors, but the strategic value of the technology soon overshadowed the moral reckoning. For Washington, the priority was no longer justice. It was the Cold War. Within months, the U.S. had integrated German rocket teams into military research programs under assumed identities. Their Nazi affiliations were scrubbed, their records sealed, and they were quietly relocated to bases in Texas, Alabama, and New Mexico. For many of the captured scientists, it was surreal. One year they had been working under Hitler's orders, the next they were eating hamburgers in an American diner, lecturing on propulsion to their former enemies. The irony was not lost on them. In the laboratories, the results were immediate. American test launches began succeeding at a pace that astonished military observers. New prototypes flew higher, faster, and with better control than anything attempted before. The scientists who had once served the Reich were now driving America's technological renaissance. When von Braun spoke before U.S. Army engineers, he told them bluntly, "You have the rockets. Now you must build the future." His confidence was disarming. The captured rocket program soon evolved into something greater, the foundation for America's ballistic missile systems and later NASA's space program. But in those early days of 1945 and 1946, the priority was still secrecy. American intelligence agencies classified thousands of pages of German research under national security directives, preventing the Soviets, and even American civilians, from understanding just how vast the scientific gap had been. The Germans had not only mastered rocketry, they had pioneered jet propulsion, synthetic fuels, and early computer-guided systems. As one American colonel later recalled, it was like opening a vault from the future. He wasn't exaggerating. The discovery of the German scientific archives transformed the U.S. military-industrial complex overnight. Laboratories that had once struggled for funding were suddenly flooded with new ideas, all stamped "Made in Germany." It was a moment of technological awakening and moral compromise. In post-war interviews, many German scientists expressed disbelief at how swiftly the Americans acted. They had expected trials, interrogations, perhaps imprisonment. Instead, they were offered contracts, laboratories, and homes. For men who had seen their world collapse, it was both unsettling and convenient. They spoke of survival, of serving science, of avoiding the Soviets, but behind the technical jargon was a quieter truth. They were trading one empire for another. The American officers who had captured them justified their speed in cold, strategic terms. The Soviets, after all, were not far behind. In their eyes, the world was entering a new kind of war, one that would be fought not with tanks and rifles, but with equations and engineers. The Germans had built the rockets that terrorized London. Now those same rockets would defend America. It was a paradox that history would never fully reconcile. By the time the public began to learn the truth years later, the scientists had already become indispensable. Wernher von Braun stood on American soil, designing missiles that would one day carry astronauts instead of explosives. But for the men who first entered the tunnels of Mittelwerk, who smelled the oil and dust and death, the memory of that discovery lingered. They had captured not just weapons, but a legacy born from the darkest corners of human ambition. And they knew, even then, that the world would never be the same. When the dust settled and Germany lay in ruins, the true magnitude of what the Americans had accomplished began to surface. The US had not merely defeated the Reich militarily, it had absorbed its scientific brainpower with an efficiency that stunned both allies and enemies alike. In the years that followed, this secret collaboration reshaped the global balance of power. Operation Paperclip, initially a desperate wartime measure, evolved into a permanent bridge between two worlds that should never have met: the ingenuity of German rocketry and the industrial might of the United States. In the spring of 1946, the first V-2 rockets launched from the desert sands of White Sands proving ground in New Mexico. The same engines that had once screamed toward London now arced gracefully across American skies, their trails glowing white against the blue. Onlookers, military officials, scientists, and reporters watched in awe as the missiles shattered altitude records. Few in the crowd understood that nearly every bolt, valve, and circuit came from German hands. Fewer still knew that the man standing near the launch pad, hands clasped behind his back, was Wernher von Braun himself, wearing an American uniform. The Americans moved quickly to domesticate their new talent. Huntsville, Alabama, soon became the unlikely heart of America's rocket future. Families from across Germany arrived under government escort, their names changed, their histories sanitized. They were given houses, schools for their children, and access to state-of-the-art laboratories. It was a strange kind of exile, comfortable, yet shadowed by the knowledge of what they had once served. In conversations after hours, they still spoke German, reminiscing about Peenemünde, about the dream of reaching the stars, and about the war that had twisted that dream into a nightmare. Back in Washington, not everyone was comfortable with the arrangement. Reports of Nazi affiliations circulated quietly among congressional staffers. Some officials argued that men with SS ranks should not be rewarded with American citizenship. But the counterargument was always the same: the Soviets were racing ahead. Intelligence showed that the USSR had also captured rocket experts, including Helmut Gertrup, a former colleague of von Braun. In response, American officials tightened secrecy further. The scientists were not to be questioned about their pasts, nor were their identities to be made public. The new front line was technological, and the stakes were nothing less than control of the skies. Meanwhile, in the laboratories of Redstone Arsenal, progress accelerated at a dizzying pace. Von Braun's team began adapting the V-2 into the Redstone missile, a reliable, guided weapon that could deliver nuclear payloads. Every successful test brought America closer to strategic supremacy. The same engineers who had once designed terror for Hitler were now building deterrence for Truman. In their notebooks, diagrams of rocket engines sat beside equations describing orbital trajectories. The dream of spaceflight, long suppressed under the war's shadow, began to re-emerge. The irony wasn't lost on von Braun. He spoke often about space as humanity's destiny, about exploration as redemption. Yet the reality was more complex. The rockets being built in Huntsville were instruments of destruction, and their success owed itself to lessons learned under the most brutal conditions imaginable. When questioned about the slave labor at Middlework, von Braun deflected. "We were scientists," he said. "We wanted to reach the stars." To some, it sounded like denial, to others it was survival. Across the ocean, the Soviets were catching up. Under the leadership of Sergei Korolev, they tested their own modified V-2s and began developing long-range missiles. Intelligence reports described frantic activity in secret facilities across Eastern Europe. The Cold War had begun, and its first battles were fought not with armies but with altitude records. Each side sought to outpace the other in range, precision, and payload. The Germans, who had once been enemies, were now unwilling participants in this new rivalry, their skills fueling both sides of an ideological divide that split the world in two. By the early 1950s, the fruits of Paperclip had begun to pay off in ways even the military hadn't predicted. American aerospace companies, Bell, North American, Boeing, absorbed German expertise into their design teams. Concepts like swept wings, turbojet propulsion, and high-speed aerodynamics all bore traces of German origin. The scientists didn't just bring blueprints, they brought an entire way of thinking: efficiency, experimentation, relentless iteration. It was this mindset that propelled American aviation from subsonic flight to the sound barrier within a decade. Then came the moment that reignited the race: the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957. The small beeping satellite shocked the world and humiliated the United States. For the first time, it became clear that the Soviets were ahead in space. Panic rippled through Washington. Committees were formed, funding poured into research, and the president demanded answers. The solution, ironically, came from the same men the U.S. had once captured from the ruins of Nazi Germany. Von Braun and his team proposed launching America's own satellite using their Jupiter C rocket, a direct descendant of the V-2. When Explorer 1 finally reached orbit in 1958, it marked not only America's entry into space, but also the redemption of a technology once forged in war. NASA was born that same year, and with it, the German scientists were finally brought into the open. Von Braun became the face of the space program, appearing on television, giving lectures, even collaborating with Walt Disney to popularize space exploration for American audiences. To the public, he was a visionary, a symbol of progress. Few mentioned that his early dreams had been funded by the Third Reich. History, it seemed, preferred inspiration to introspection. In time, the rockets grew taller, the engines louder, the ambitions grander. Redstone led to Jupiter, Jupiter to Saturn, and Saturn to the mighty Saturn V, the vehicle that would carry humans to the moon. When Apollo 11 lifted off in 1969, the culmination of 20 years of research, the world watched in wonder. Von Braun stood among the crowd at Cape Kennedy, his face expressionless as the thunder rolled across the Florida coast. For him, it was the realization of a lifelong dream, a rocket not built for war but for exploration. Yet beneath the triumph lay an inescapable truth. Without the desperate speed and moral compromises of 1945, that dream might never have left the ground. Historians still debate whether paperclip was a necessary evil or a betrayal of justice. Some argue that without it, America would have fallen behind the Soviets, possibly losing the Cold War before it began. Others insist that by protecting former Nazis, the U.S. compromised the very values it claimed to defend. Both sides are right in their own way. The legacy of that operation is one of paradox, scientific brilliance born from moral ruin, progress forged in the aftermath of atrocity. For the German scientists who crossed the Atlantic, the war never truly ended. They carried their ghosts with them, buried beneath patents, equations, and lunar modules. Some spent the rest of their lives justifying their choices. Others avoided the topic altogether. Yet in the silence of space, the place they had dreamed of since the 1930s, there was perhaps a kind of uneasy peace. When the Apollo missions concluded and von Braun retired, he often reflected on how swiftly history had turned. "We wanted to learn how to fly to the stars," he once said. "But first, we had to learn how to survive ourselves." Those words, spoken by a man whose genius was both admired and condemned, captured the heart of the paperclip story. The speed with which American teams captured Germany's rocket secrets was more than a triumph of intelligence. It was a glimpse of humanity's dual nature: inventive and destructive, curious and cruel. From the tunnels of Middlework to the surface of the moon, the line between those two sides remained painfully thin. And though the world would celebrate the rockets that carried men into the heavens, the shadow of where they began would always follow them, silent and undeniable, written into the very engines that made them fly. Written into the very engines that made them fly.